Welcome to The F Word, a podcast series that examines, excavates, unpicks and reframes forgiveness through the lives of others. I'm Marina Cantacuzino, a journalist from London, founder of the Forgiveness Project charity, and I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. I'll be talking fortnightly to a guest who's experienced something very difficult or traumatic in their life, but who rather than respond with hate or bitterness has embraced, or at the very least considered, forgiveness as a response to pain. So for this episode of the F Word podcast, I'm going to be talking to a father who has not only forgiven his son's killer, but also done everything in his power to help others deal with their own pain and trauma. Azim Khamisa is a thought leader, peace activist, prolific author and international speaker who has dedicated the past 25 years of his life to the important work of the Tariq Khamisa Foundation. So welcome, Azim. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for being a guest on the F Word podcast.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Shall we start, Azim, right at the beginning with Tariq, your son? Because one of the things that's always moved me hearing your story is how quickly you came to a point of some kind of resolution about it. But I think let's hear a little bit about Tariq and what happened, if you don't mind, just starting there.
Sure. So Tariq was my only son. He was a good kid. He was a student at San Diego State University. So he was a good writer, a good photographer. He was blessed with a great sense of humor. His favorite hero was Gandhi. His dream was someday to work for National Geographic and become a journalist. And he worked on Fridays and Saturdays as a pizza delivery man while he was going to college to earn some extra money. And he was lured to a bogus address in San Diego. So he got in his car and got to the apartment building, knocked on many doors, trying to find out who'd ordered the pizzas. Of course, nobody had. He came back to his car, put the pizzas in the trunk of his car, and as he was about to leave the scene of the crime, he was accosted by 4 youth gang members. 3 of them were 14-year-old, and the leader of the gang was an 18-year-old, who handed a 9mm handgun in a gang initiation ritual, which came through the driver's side window. My son was already in his car trying to leave the scene of the crime. But it was fatal, and as the coroner explained to me later, that the bullet followed a perfect path. A perfect path, I queried. I thought that was an interesting choice of words. But he was very quick to tell me, he says, "Mr. Khamisa, I'm not trying to be insensitive. We don't see a path like this very often. And what it means in my lingo is that it destroyed all the vital organs in your son's body. And Tariq died drowning in his own blood a couple of minutes later over a lousy pizza at the young age of 20. And I had just returned from a business trip to Mexico. So the homicide that came to my house, I wasn't there, and they left a little card, which I saw the next morning, and there was a note from homicide that says, "We're trying to reach Tariq's family. Please give us a call." I called them on the phone. Sergeant Lambert, I remember her name, and she told me on the phone what had happened to Tariq. Of course, I didn't believe it, because I think as a parent, it's very difficult to hear your children die before you do. My immediate knee-jerk reaction was like a mistaken identity. So I quickly hung up on him because he had just moved in with his girlfriend Jennifer. They had gotten engaged into their own apartment, and called his apartment, fully expecting him to pick up the phone. Of course, he didn't. Jennifer did. And she was just sobbing on the phone. And that is when it hit me. I was in my kitchen. I lost strength in both of my legs as I collapsed to the floor, hit my head against the refrigerator and curled up into a ball. I don't have the words to describe how excruciatingly painful that experience was for me, but I never in my life had felt pain like that. It's literally like a nuclear bomb that went off in your heart. And the pain was so excruciating that I remember leaving my body. And I've since read that victims that suffer deep trauma often do leave their body because you can't be in your body. I practice as a Sufi Muslim. I used to meditate an hour a day when Tariq was alive. Today my practice is 2 hours a day. I believe in God. And I believe I left my body and went into a loving embrace of God. I don't recall how long I was gone, but I remember being held in this embrace. And then when the explosion subsided, God sent me back into my body with the wisdom that there are victims at both ends of the gun.
Well, that's extraordinary. I mean, that was like within minutes, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And I made some very difficult calls to call his mother. I mean, that was, you tell a mother she's never going to see her son again. Made all of those gut-wrenching, excruciating calls. And then I called my best friend, because I live by myself. And they said, don't do anything, we'll be there. And sure enough, my best friend and his wife were there within an hour and a half of me finding out. And then my best friend's wife went to get Tariq's fiancée. I was alone with my best friend. And the first thing in his mouth was that whoever these kids are that killed Tariq, I hope they fry in hell. And I looked at him and I told him, I don't feel that way. I see that there are victims at both ends of the gun. And I remember he broke down and cried. He says, Azim, where do you get this strength? If somebody took my son Adam's life, not only would I want the killer, I would want the whole clan.
Was he impressed, moved, or angry with you for feeling that way?
He was very moved, emotional, and he's not a violent person.
But his reaction was more like you would expect.
Exactly. I never went there. And I think what I've learned in the aftermath, that sometimes in deep trauma and tragedy, there is a spark of clarity. And it didn't come from my intellect. I don't think us mortals are capable of it. It didn't come from my loving heart. Rather, it was a download from a higher power.
And also survival mechanism.
Yes.
I mean, without that, who knows where you would have gone.
Exactly. And I think that looking back at it, that download that I got from the higher power 9 months later led me to start the foundation, having learned the challenges of youth violence in America is pretty bad.
The foundation, which is in your son's name?
Yes, correct. So it's 9 months after he died, and having learned the plight of kids killing kids, which is a huge problem in America. I still weep when I think about Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, 20 first graders.
Yeah, young children, 6, 7-year-olds.
Babies were gunned down in machine gun fire. So in the richest country in the world.
By the way, Sandy Hook claimed 26 lives in total, 20 first graders plus 6 staff members. And it remains the deadliest mass shooting at an elementary or high school in US history. If you're interested in reading a story that will chime with much of what Azim says, check out the story of Scarlett Lewis on the Forgiveness Project website. Scarlett's 6-year-old son, Jesse, was murdered in that terrible massacre in 2012.
So I felt as an American citizen that I must take my share of the responsibility for the bullet that took my son's life, because it was fired by an American child. And I'm a first-generation American citizen. I was born in Kenya of Eastern roots and emigrated to the US to get away from the violence of Idi Amin because we were a minority and targeted as a result, thinking my children would be safer in America. So it was very ironic that he died on a country and a city that I had picked for him. But I felt that losing so many young people that I had to do something about it. So when I started the foundation, of course it was to honor my son. And our initial mission was to stop kids from killing kids. And I started with a very simple premise that violence is a learned behavior. No child was born violent. Tony, who killed my son, wasn't born violent.
With Tony, he was 14 years old when he took your son's life. He went to prison soon after, as a child still, and has only very recently been released at the age of 39. And that's a long time in prison. Many people who lose loved ones say the longer someone is in prison, the greater the value of my loved one's life. Did you ever feel that? Did you ever feel, yes, he needs to go to prison, he needs to learn a lesson, he needs to stay in there for decades?
No.
Never?
No. He was the first 14-year-old to be tried as an adult. They just reduced the law where from 16 to 14, that in a capital case like murder, they could essentially judge him as an adult, so then they can give him a life sentence, because if he had been judged as a juvenile, he would have been out when he was 25. And I was in favor of the most lenient sentence for him, because at 14 you are not an adult. But it was not in my hands, because it was the state of California against Tony Hicks. So I thought it was way too long for a 14-year-old to be put away for that long. And I finally met him when he was 19. I started the foundation, forgave him. And then soon after I started the foundation, I reached out to the grandfather and guardian of my son's killer.
Hang on, let's back up there.
Yeah.
You just say, started the foundation and forgave him. I mean, some people would just fall off their seats when they hear you saying that.
Right.
You must have struggled to forgive him. You can't just forgive like that, can you?
As I said, I saw that there were victims at both ends of the gun, that he was not the enemy.
Who was the enemy then?
Well, I saw that the enemy was the societal forces that forced many young men, especially young men of color, to fall to the crack and then choose lives of crime and gangs and drugs and alcohol and weapons, as he was. He was radicalized, much like we see radicalized terrorism. So that the enemy was the societal forces. And I felt that we as a country had not done enough to make sure young people like Tony don't fall to the crack. And then soon after I started the foundation, I reached out to the grandfather of my son's killer. With the attitude, I'm not here screaming revenge or retribution. Rather, I see we both lost a son. Because Tony lived with his grandfather and calls him daddy. I can't bring my son back from the dead, and there's nothing you can do to get Tony out of adult prison. And I've started this foundation with a very lofty mission of stopping kids from killing kids. And the real reason I'm here is to ask for your help, because I can't do this by myself. And it behooves us to work together, because it was your grandson that killed my son. Will you help me? And he's African American, he's Christian, I'm Muslim, I'm Eastern. And we are together 25 years later as brothers. And he was very quick to take my hand of forgiveness. So it took me 5 years eventually to go visit Tony.
And how was that meeting?
It was very cathartic for both of us. I remember meditating several thousand hours to get the courage to do this. And I recognized that for me to complete my journey of forgiveness, I eventually had to come eyeball to eyeball with Tony. And I asked the grandfather, his name is Pleasure, to go with me, because it was the first time I met Tony. And I told him, I also like you to introduce me to Tony, but then I need some alone time with him, because you are his grandfather, and I have some tough questions of him, and he will be defensive with you. So Ples was very gracious. He left us alone for an hour and a half. And Tony and I talked man to man. And I could tell that my forgiveness had shifted him, because he was well-mannered, he was articulate, he was remorseful. Plus, I knew Tony was not going to repeat that behavior.
So this reminds me of episode 4 of the F Word podcast with Jacob Dunn, who was convicted of manslaughter for killing a young man. And he talks about the huge responsibility he feels to the family of his victim because his transformation has been so helpful and so meaningful for them. I'm not saying that those who've hurt others should live without this pressure to change. I mean, in many ways, it really is the very least they should do. But sometimes I wonder how that plays out. And I also realise that it's an incredibly difficult and courageous direction to take, to promise to change yourself for the sake of your victims. And I think it proves, to me at least, that entering into this transformative process is much harder than, say, serving a very long prison sentence without ever embracing issues of repentance and responsibility. Anyway, I then asked Azim about this issue of offenders asking victims for forgiveness. Did he ask for your forgiveness?
Yes, he'd already asked for my forgiveness in the parole hearing.
Did you find that healing for yourself?
Absolutely, yeah.
Why?
Yeah. I mean, because I think that I'd already forgiven him before he asked for my forgiveness, but him asking for my forgiveness was very meaningful.
Because you knew it was genuine. He was genuinely remorseful and
Right.
sorry. The reason I ask that is that I'm very interested in this asking for forgiveness, because one of the storytellers that we work with at the Forgiveness Project is a former paramilitary from Northern Ireland who killed somebody when he was a young man.
Right.
And he says he would never ask for forgiveness because that just puts an extra onus of responsibility on the victim. And he doesn't feel that's fair.
Right.
But it's interesting because when I hear you, I can absolutely understand why that helped you, because it showed you just how genuine his sorrow was for what he'd done.
Right.
Because you don't ask for forgiveness unless you feel you've done something terribly wrong, do you?
Exactly, no. I think at the end of the day, we've all harmed people as well, and that can become a festering wound. And just like the offender needs to heal that wound by self-forgiveness, that part of that process is to ask for forgiveness. Whether it's granted or not, I think it's important to ask. But to ask with that sincerity, where you really mean it, and also to be clear that this is something that he would never, ever repeat. In that first meeting, there were some questions in my mind. There were holes in the story which I was able to complete. The big takeaway and the big blessing is at one point in that hour and a half, we locked eyeballs. And I'm looking in his eyes, and he's looking in my eyes, and we kept that glance for what seemed like a long time. And I'm looking in his eyes trying to find a murderer. And I didn't. I was able to climb through his eyes and touch his humanity, that I got that the spark in him is no different than the spark in me or you. And I wasn't expecting that. He was a likable kid. So at that point, I told him that, I've forgiven you, because I've been working with your grandfather for a good 4 years. But I also want you to know that when you come out of prison, you can join us, and you have a job at the foundation, and you can come work with your grandfather and me. And after about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I left. And I remember the bounce in my stride was a lot more bouncier than the one I'd walked in with, because it was like a freeing. And I knew that I had, at that point, completed my journey of forgiveness. But the next day, the grandfather called me because I hadn't realized it was very similar, cathartic transformation on Tony, because he's a good-looking young man in an adult prison, which I like Zeus. It's a target. He says, he was used to tell his grandfather, I'm going to die in prison, I'm not going to make it. But he says, when you gave him some hope and some love, he's totally transformed, and so I've been in his life for the last 20 years. He's 39 years old. I met him at 19 and given him a lot of books to read, and he's very well read. He wrote a foreword to my trilogy. He's read the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. We normally, now that he's out, we see every month. And I've been trying to get him out, which was very complicated. But sure enough, his parole hearing was late 2018, and I was there advocating for his release. And it was granted, based on the fact that I told the commissioner that he has a lot of work to do, but not in prison, but on the outside, because the foundation is at schools all the time. And I think you can see the power of him on stage saying, when I was 11, I joined a gang. When I was 14, I killed Mr. Khamisa's son. I wish I could turn the clock back. And he genuinely wants to do that.
It's early days, though,
Yeah.
isn't it?
It is early days, because he finally was released into a halfway house and then moved in with his grandfather, and he's now got a job. And he's already doing blogs for the foundation, but he's not quite ready to go on stage yet. Yeah.
You speak about him with real fondness in your voice. Are you fond of him?
I am, yeah. I have very high hopes for him. I think that he will save many, many more kids, because I can't bring my son back. And really, I've taken the fatherly role with him. He didn't have a father. He was born to a 15-year-old, which was the grandfather's daughter. And the father shunned him every time he met him. So he grew up essentially with a 15-year-old mother. His grandfather was in the military and got Tony when he was 9 years old.
Because when you first spoke about him, you said that your realisation that there were victims at both ends of the gun. Now that is an understanding, but it's not forgiveness, is it? Forgiveness, I think, requires some kind of compassion.
Yeah, but I think it takes compassion to see that. I think that the precursor for forgiveness is compassion. The precursor for compassion is empathy. And the precursor for empathy is to get to know the person. Because you can't have empathy for somebody you don't know. I know everything there is to know about Tony, his entire life history. Sometimes I wonder if I had grown up just like he had. And he lived in South Central Los Angeles. His favorite uncle was gunned down when he was 8 years old. He was seduced by his uncle's girlfriend. I mean, he is a tough life. Would I have made the same choice? He joined a gang when he was 11, and then to prove himself to the gang, he shot my son at 14. And there's a great quote from Gandhi, right? Hate the sin, love the sinner. Because I think at some level we've all harmed. We are all fallible. We're all humans. And that to have that level of empathy, I think one really needs to understand the other person. I mean, the Dalai Lama has gone on to say, you can learn a lot from your enemy.
I think that's true. I mean, I often say that curiosity is a key ingredient of forgiveness as well.
Yes.
I think it has to be, because if you think you've got everyone figured out,
right,
there's nowhere to go with that.
Right.
And black and white thinking is so linear, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think forgivers are flexible thinkers.
Right.
Who know life is morally complicated and good people do bad things and bad things happen to good people.
Right, absolutely. And I think that understanding is very important. What you just said demonstrates empathy. I mean, you essentially defined what empathy is. And I think you want to live there.
You've said that in every conflict there is the opportunity for love and unity. And you've just explained how that is for you.
Right.
But how do you say that to someone who's desperately grieving and tormented and anguished and angry?
I think you have to time it. I think grieving is medicine. There's a good adage from the Turkish culture that he who conceals his grief does not find a remedy for it. So I think that you have to grieve. And I did too. It took me a good 3.5 years. And I think at some point you have to transmute that grief into action. Otherwise you remain a victim. So what I saw in this tragedy is that I didn't want to go through life as a victim. I had a very full life when Tariq was alive. I worked in the international financial services, traveled the world, made good money, good social life, and then I had no life. And I have a very good life now. Different, but very fulfilling. The only way you can move and transmute that pain is through the process of forgiveness, because that transmutes it into taking that grief and putting it into better action. It's a great quote from Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. He's an Indian philosopher. He says, "I dreamt life was joy. I woke up and I found out life was service. I acted, behold, service is joy."
I love that.
Yeah, and I think that is what I try and tell people, that, yeah, take your time to grieve. And then the next step is giving up your resentment through meditation, empathy, through setting an intention, and then to reach out, which I did, to the offender. Not everybody has to reach out to the person who murdered their child. There's a lot of grief in our families, and father, son, mother, daughter, ex-wives, ex-husbands, business partners. Sometimes you have to reach out to a person you actually love. But the point is that it takes time. And there is a process which I actually do teach in my 2-day workshop. And it's very freeing for those people that actually do get it, that for a victim to eventually heal, I don't know if there's any better way than to forgive.
I've heard you speak in schools and workshops and to policymakers. Everybody is always very affected by what you say. I've never seen any expressions on people's faces of negativity or queering anything you've done. Is that the case? Or have you received some negative responses occasionally?
No, I don't believe that I've ever had a pushback, except for one that I remember, which was very early, just a couple of years after Tariq died. And the World Forum, which was held in San Francisco, Gorbachev and Desmond Tutu were the two co-chairs, and we were in a round table with about 25 people. And of course we had to tell our story. And then the lady that spoke after me had lost a son in the conflict in Ireland. And she says, forgiveness may be your option, is not my option. She was very much about revenge and very much about wanting to see this person suffer or die, or very animated and very loud. And I was tongue-tied because it was still early, but the person that sat next to me, when finally it was his turn to speak, he spoke after me and after her, and he did a great job because he said, well, I understand your heart was broken because you lost a son. Well, don't you think Azim's heart was broken? Sure, it was broken the same way as yours. But here you see a phoenix rising from the ashes, that out of all of this devastation, something positive has manifested. And that is now helping make a better society.
Well, I remember you saying once when we were doing a workshop together, and you said to everybody, a broken heart is an open heart.
Right.
And that really landed with every single person in the room.
Yeah.
And I still think about that because I think it's true.
And I think the work that we're doing with victims is to get them to see that. Because once you get that a broken heart is an open heart, then gentle transformations begin to manifest, because it takes an open heart to receive and send love and empathy and compassion and forgiveness. And we're very quick in our society to judge and close our hearts. You cannot get to forgiveness or compassion with a closed heart. I work very hard to leave my heart open. And this is a quote from Rumi that says, God will break your heart over and over and over and over and over and over again until it stays open. One of the biggest impediment in forgiveness is judgment. A closed heart judges. An open heart never judges because it's inclusive. So that's...
That's not to say that you can't fight for justice and make judgments about unfairness and abuse, is it?
No, I think part of the justice process is obviously to make sure that you do all you can to restore the victim to the extent possible. You can't bring my son back by working with grandfather and now working with Tony by using the principles of restorative justice. It's meaningful. Less kids are ending up dead or ending up in prison. But the second part of justice is to bring the offender back into society as a functioning and a contributing member, which we've done with Tony. Once they've shifted and transformed, they're applied experts. We've used offenders. They're very passionate about making sure that other young people don't follow in their former footsteps. And the third part is to heal the community, because crime happens in the context of community. In the foundation working in schools, we see a lot of drop in violence, not just in the school, but in that entire community. So I think that part of social justice is to have the mindset within every crime, there's an opportunity to make a better society.
What you do with the foundation obviously really feeds your soul. It's terribly important. You're doing a lot of good work with others. But it all has come about through the death of your son. And I just wonder how you square that, really, because obviously you would much, much prefer that had never, ever happened.
Yes. Well, I think we all have a spiritual purpose. And sometimes it's complicated to know what that is. Not for me. And the gift that my son gave me was to put me onto this work, because I wouldn't be doing this had he not been so tragically taken away. And so it's a 22-year journey that's very dark. It started with murder but ended in peace. And I have a level of peace that comes through my work that I never had before.
Thank you, Azim. And I think it's been great catching up with you, and you're always so inspiring. I learn a lot from you every time we speak.
Well, thank you, Marina.
I want to say thank you so much for coming in and being on the F Word podcast.
Okay, you're welcome, and thanks for doing all the work you're doing. You've always been somebody I've admired and respected, and I always considered you as part of my family.
Oh, thank you. I think it's a very fitting ending to my interview with Azim to share with you a trailer for one of my favourite podcasts, Justice, hosted by Edwina Grosvenor, a patron and long-time supporter of the Forgiveness Project.
Welcome to Justice, a podcast series brought to you by the charity One Small Thing. I'm Edwina Grosvenor, prison philanthropist and founder of One Small Thing. Our mission is to reduce the number of women within the justice system and to ensure that services that support residents and those who have left the system are informed about, responsive to, and provide specific help to heal from trauma. Essentially, we want to shift the conversation from what's wrong with them to what's happened to them. I talk to guests who all have different relationships and experiences with the justice system and who generally have quite a lot to say about what could and should be done to make the system work better. Join me in learning more about justice, available on all podcast platforms.
Thank you for listening to the F Word podcast. This podcast is the last episode in the current series, but do look out for Series 2 coming soon. And finally, to dig a bit deeper around some of the themes we've talked about, do check out the show notes by going to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. And from there you can also explore the Forgiveness Project website, which over the years has collected and shared many more stories of how people have transformed the darkest of situations. I also want to invite you to join the F Word Podcast Facebook group, especially if you have more to discuss or share. Again, to find the link, go to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. All these podcasts have grown out of years of trying to shift the narrative of our time away from one of hate and division towards empathy and understanding. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider donating even just the smallest amount to help us continue our work. All details of how to do this, again, are on the show notes page of our website. But most of all, I hope you'll join me again